a home in Tillsonburg, Ontario, the Tillsonburg of Stompin' Tom and tobacco country and so on, costs more than a home in Tokyo, Japan. This desire to own a 3-bedroom home is not going to go away. The families are going to keep moving to Peterborough and Belleville and so on. And we just have to deal with that.
Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Sabrina Maddeaux.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
Today, we're talking about a new report showing how the GTA shortage of family-friendly housing created a ripple effect throughout Eastern and Southern Ontario. And spoiler alert, it's going to keep getting worse unless we face reality about what families actually need.
And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
So, Mike, you've got a new report out this week. We'll link to it in the show notes on housing shortages in Eastern Ontario. But reading it, it's really about how young GTA families are struggling to find affordable homes where they can actually raise kids. And you think it's going to get worse because politicians and planners just don't get it. And in my experience, that's very true. We've talked about this many times on the show about the trend of shoebox condos that are really made for investors and not families. And when you're a young person, even just living with a partner, and let's say you work from home, it's hard enough to find somewhere suitably sized to live, let alone having a child or children. So your report lays out a narrative in 7 parts, and I'd like to go through them one at a time. Now, first up, you estimate Ontario had a shortage of 500,000 homes as of 2021, and nearly 400,000 of those were what you call ground-oriented ownership homes. So first of all, how'd you calculate that? And what does ground-oriented ownership home, which is a mouthful, even mean?
Yeah, it's not a great term. I think a better term would be something that's not an apartment that you own instead of rent. So it includes single detached, but it also includes duplexes, townhomes, stacked townhomes, fourplexes, a lot of kind of missing middle housing that we talk a lot about here. And why that's important is that families are looking for that type of housing, like families with kids, that they want 3-bedroom homes, and they don't want to be on the 57th floor somewhere. They don't want to be on a 6th-floor apartment along a busy arterial. They want space where they can send the kids outside and run around and play. So that tends to drive migration patterns. So what we did is we have this tool called the ROCA benchmark, which just basically says, given the size of the population and their age distribution, how many homes and of what type do we need? And what we found was that while we had this 500,000 home shortage, what we were really short of mostly was that kind of ground-oriented ownership homes. And the vast majority of that shortage was in the GTA, not surprisingly. And what the report shows is that over time, that shortage has gotten worse and worse in the GTA because we're just not building those homes and the population is growing. And it's causing an increase in out-migration of families looking for those types of homes. And in our view, that I don't think planners and politicians get this because they're in this kind of unit is a unit mindset where they say, okay, Toronto needs this many homes and Mississauga needs this many and Kingston needs that many, but they don't differentiate between the types of homes. And what we're seeing, particularly in the GTA, is planners and politicians making all these plans to add, tons of apartments everywhere. And we do need more apartments, and the report shows that, but we need a diversity of housing types. So the kind of subtext of the report is that as politicians and policymakers and planners really kind of ramp up apartment buildings in these cities in the GTA, that's going to cause a further outmigration of families to places like Peterborough and Barrie, and even up to Kingston and Ottawa. And politicians and planners in your Kingstons, your Ottawas, and Peterboroughs, we don't think they're ready for that because we think they're underestimating the amount of these drive until you qualify families.
Interesting. Now, next, you make the point that back in 2016, this wasn't really an Ontario problem, it was a GTA problem. So the GTA wasn't building enough housing, and what was getting built didn't work for families. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go back and look at the census 2016 data, that it was a bit of housing shortage in non-GTA markets, and it was pretty isolated. Like Hamilton had a housing shortage. There was a bit of one in Ottawa. But if you look at your Londons, your Windsors, your Kingstons, they had about the amount of housing you would expect relative to the size and demographics of their population. There might have been some rental apartment shortages here and there, but for the most part, they had enough housing. But fast forward to 2021, and this kind of housing shortage emerged in these cities, and that was partly because of increases in international students and in immigration and so on. But a lot of that shortage was people moving to Tilsonburg or Woodstock and places like that, and those communities just not being able to keep up with the demand. And again, where that shortage manifested itself was in that ground oriented ownership housing. That apartments, both rentals and condos, were largely able to keep up. There were some shortages in ground oriented rental housing because that was a popular thing with students, both domestic and international. But the GTA really did export its housing crisis to southern and eastern Ontario because of this influx of what we call drive until you qualify families.
So, next you get into population growth. And I'm sure our listeners know a lot of this story, but give us the quick version.
Yeah, because the question kind of becomes, okay, what makes 2016 so special, right? Like, why were kind of things fine outside of the GTA in 2016, and then all of a sudden by 2021, not? And the answer is population growth. That Ontario had consistently been growing by about 100,000 to 120,000 people per year. And then almost overnight in 2015, our population growth rate doubled. We went from like 100,000 to 200,000 overnight. And there were a few things driving that immigration targets went up. The real start of the international student boom was around 2015, 2016. And the other thing that we saw was that when we had the oil price collapse in 2015, a lot of Ontarians who had moved out to Fort McMurray or Calgary or Edmonton 5 or 10 years earlier, they started moving back. And planners planned for none of this. And, you and I are often hard on municipalities, and like rightfully so. But this is one where I think that we have to give municipalities a bit of a pass on that. They don't set immigration targets. They didn't see the international student boom coming, though perhaps they should have. And obviously, they can't predict global oil prices. So that's not on them. But it would suggest what is on them is that the systems that we have at the municipal level aren't particularly flexible. They don't deal well with sudden increases in population. You don't all of a sudden go, oh, wow, the population is going up quickly. So let's immediately change zoning or let's immediately open up a bunch of new land to development. So we have these systems that don't really respond well. They're not very elastic to when other things change.
Yeah, the population boom is just so frustrating to me because, especially at the federal level, they were warned the impact this would have on housing availability and affordability, and they went ahead anyways. And it's not just housing either. I've written about this a lot that it also led to shortages and increased wait times in our healthcare system. We look at the impact on employment now, and these numbers were just never sustainable. Your fourth and fifth points explain how the GTA's housing mess broke markets across Ontario using your favorite term, drive until you qualify. Now, families literally get in their cars and drive as far as they need to get that home that they can afford. And the numbers are pretty wild. The GTA went from losing 20,000 people a year to the rest of Ontario before 2014 to over 40,000 per year pre pandemic to 70,000 a year since 2019. So, who exactly is leaving the GTA? Why are they leaving? And where are they going?
So basically, we're seeing all ages leave, but not in kind of equal proportions. There's two groups leaving far more than anyone else, and it's adults between the ages of 25 and 39, and kids under the age of 15. And you could imagine why. You're someone who lives in a condo, and I can't imagine raising a kid there. I'm sure you couldn't either. So that's where you get this drive until you qualify for. You get people in their 30s, baby comes along or baby's on the way, and they're like, this ain't gonna work. Like, this is a non-starter, so we're going to move. And this has happened for a while. And it used to be 25 years ago they'd move to Mississauga or Brampton. 10 or 15 years ago, it might have been a place like Hamilton, which we're still seeing. And you have these kind of traditional destinations for them: Hamilton, Barrie, Kitchener, Waterloo, and so on. But we're now seeing further and further out migration. Places like I mentioned, like London and Woodstock and Tillsonburg in the Southwest, that we wouldn't really have seen prior to 2015. But we're also seeing big migrations east to Eastern Ontario. So Peterborough, Belleville, and smaller communities in Prince Edward County. And it's clear what they're looking for. They want a home they can own. They don't want to rent for the most part. They want 3 bedrooms or more. And you look at the data in Ontario, over 3/4, more than 3/4 of all couples with children live in that type of housing. And it's because that 87% of all ground-oriented ownership homes have 3 or more bedrooms, whereas only 10% of rental apartments do, right? So, if you want a 3-bedroom home, you're not going to find it in a rental apartment. You need a ground-oriented home just because of issues around zoning and building code and so on. And we've created this shortage of ground oriented housing in our GTA communities because of both supply and demand reasons. That demand obviously is just population growth, but supply, we created all of these restrictions around urban growth boundaries. Could get into a conversation about the green belt, and we will sometime. And I know that's one of the most popular questions we get from our listeners.
We're going to need a whole nother episode for that, Mike.
We'll save that one for later. And then, some of them is just, a lack of land. Like in the city of Toronto, there's not that much land, greenfield land left available because bordering cities on 3 sides. And then you've got Lake Ontario to the south. So this demand supply imbalance is causing this outmigration. And this outmigration is causing skyrocketing prices and rents in your Londons, your Woodstocks, your Tillsonburgs, and so on. Like one of my favorite data points is that back in the peak in 2022, a home in Tillsonburg, Ontario, the Tillsonburg of Stompin' Tom and tobacco country and so on, costs more than a home in Tokyo, Japan. And people might say, okay, well, Mike, that's not a fair comparison because, the home in Tillsonburg's a lot larger than the home in Tokyo. And my response to that is, yeah, but what's the subway system like in Tillsonburg, right? Yeah. So in Tillsonburg, over the last 10 years, prices have grown there faster in percentage terms than anywhere in Canada. So the GTA's housing dysfunction has caused a wave of unaffordability all across these regions.
Mm-hmm. So we've covered the past, but your report looks ahead to 2051, projecting how much housing each region needs to keep up with growth and fix past shortages. And you basically conclude the GTA will never build enough of the homes middle-class families actually want. And that's pretty bleak. So how'd you land on that?
Yeah, so we just used our ROCA benchmark model and looked at both ground-oriented homes and apartments and looked at projected age distribution over time and go, okay, this is how many homes we'll need. So to be clear, this takes into account population aging. Like this takes into account older people going into long-term care homes, passing away, that kind of generational turnover. So we're taking that into account. We say, even when we take that into account, the GTA, which we define, and I should back up a little bit, we define for the purposes of this report, the GTA to be Peel region, York region, City of Toronto, and Durham region. So the Oshawa area as well. We say, you look at the data, and that region is going to need somewhere in the range of 900,000 to 1 million new ground-oriented homes in the next 30 years. And there's just no way. Like, there's no way that's going to happen. Even if we were able to build those homes at the rate we did in the past, it would take about 95 years, and we've got less than 30. So it's not going to happen. And then, you look at issues around the amount of land and so on. It's a non-starter. So what we're saying is, because that's not going to happen, what we're projecting is what cities will do is try and build more and more apartments. And again, the report shows that we need more apartments. But what we're saying is that what the Ontario Ministry of Finance, and that's their population projections, and other cities are not counting on, is that this desire to own a 3-bedroom home is not going to go away. The families are going to keep moving to Peterborough and Belleville and so on. And we just have to deal with that. We have to plan for that. So that's what we're saying, and this report is designed to be a wake-up call to mayors and councils across Eastern Ontario, saying you can't just rely on population forecasts when doing your planning, because those population forecasts are assuming the GTA is going to build enough homes to house all the families it has. That's not going to happen. It's just not realistic, and we need to understand that.
Yeah, families need a place to live, and that's definitely not going to change. And your final point is if the GTA keeps falling short, even more families will flood Eastern Ontario, and those communities aren't ready. So, what should they be doing that they're not?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we recommend in the report. So number one is that we suggest that the province of Ontario, like right now, they have their housing targets for different areas as part of their Building Faster fund, but there's no differentiation between the types of homes, and it's not even clear that the province took into account things like land availability and infrastructure or so on. So the first thing that we're saying is that the province needs to have targets that are more granular, saying this is what we expect in apartments, which again will be some mix of condos and non-condos. This is what we need in terms of ground-oriented housing. So that's number one. Number two is that we need the Ontario Ministry of Finance when they're doing their population projections to take better account of this drive until you qualify. And we're saying until that happens, mayors and councils in their official plans in Ontario, need to go above and beyond just what's in the population forecast. It is just not sufficient. And then the final thing I'll point out is that we also need to figure out how to create a better diversity of family friendly homes. Because I know some are going to interpret this as saying, like, oh, Moffatt and MMI are just saying, okay, we need a sea of single detached homes everywhere. We're not saying that either, right? We are saying that we need all types of housing suitable for families. So we need to figure out how to create great 3-bedroom homes that suits the needs of families. So this is multiplexes, small apartments, and so on. And there's a lot of zoning and building code changes that need to happen. We've discussed some on this show, like staircase reform and elevator reform, and so on. So to be clear, we are not suggesting for a moment that this all has to be single detached homes. We need policymakers to make it easier to build family friendly, missing middle type housing so we can have efficient use of land, but we can still have homes that work, that are affordable, that work for families with kids.
Yeah, I think the point is you're not going to tell, millions of young Canadians to suddenly change their preferences to live in apartments when they want spaces that are big enough for families. And to think that you can do that is just not realistic.
Yeah, and that's the implicit assumption. Yeah, like you're absolutely right, and that's a kind of unstated assumption in a lot of this municipal planning and even provincial planning that young generations are going to be fine raising kids on the 57th floor of a condo building, or on the 6th floor of an apartment that opens up to a heavy arterial road. They're just not.
Yeah, in their windowless den with the streetcars screeching nearby.
Well, or that's it as well,
Yeah.
right? They treat a unit as a unit as a unit, right? That a shoebox condo is somehow equivalent to a 3-bedroom townhouse. That they both count the same, and they don't. And we need to recognize that these targets that we're setting up don't really understand the diversity of family needs. And I've done a lot of talking in this podcast. So I've got a question for you, because this report is all around, this idea that families will leave the GTA and move to either Southern Ontario or, as this report focuses on, Eastern Ontario. Is this something that you would consider doing? And if so, what would make moving to a community in Eastern Ontario more attractive for you?
Potentially. I mean, ultimately, if and when I have a child, I am not in a place that would be suitable for raising a family right now. And I would need to be in one that's larger and one that I can afford. And right now, that place isn't in Toronto. The thing that complicates this is, of course, jobs, especially with return to office mandates. And we just did an episode on that we can also link to in the show notes. And that's really difficult for young people because when you move outside of the GTA, your employment options, especially in certain industries, really diminish or go to zero in some cases. And then you look at unemployment and long term unemployment right now. And so young people are really facing these pressures from all fronts, which is just leading more into that frustration and anger and disillusionment with everything. Because even if you do decide to move outside of your community or Toronto where you prefer to live and where you have social connections and families, it's then, well, where do you work? Where do you make a living?
Mm.
So it's a really difficult decision all around, and it's not an easy one. And it's unfortunate that it doesn't seem like it's going to get better anytime soon. And the answer isn't for politicians or planners to think young people will just get over it and change their preferences. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for watching and listening, and to our amazing producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions or want more trivia on Tillsonburg, Ontario, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.